My name is Elias Shomali. I am the Vice Chairman of your Board of Trustees. On behalf of the Trustees of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs, I welcome you all tonight or this evening. First of all, I would like to express our thanks to our co-sponsors of the reception outside, the Arab American Club of Baltimore and the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, the Baltimore Chapter. Announcing our upcoming programs, on April 8th, Dr. Lawrence Korb, Director of Studies, Council on Foreign Relations, will speak on national defense in the 21st century. April 14, Mr. Nibocha Vijovic, the Minister Chief of Mission, Embassy of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, will speak on Kosovo and the future of Yugoslavia, a Serbian perspective. Of course, what else? On April 22nd, Dr. Shoal Bakhash, the Clarence Robinson Professor of History at George Mason University, will speak on the future of Iran-US relations. All these activities will be held here, and we hope that you all be able to attend. That brings us to tonight's speech by our guest, Ambassador Clovis Maksoud. He is presently Professor of International Relations and Director of the Center for the Global South at the American University in Washington, D.C. A Lebanese national, Dr. Maksoud was the chief representative of the League of the Arab States in India from 1961 to 1966. From 1967 to 1979, he served as the senior editor of the Al-Ahram and then chief editor of An-Nahar Weekly. Ambassador Maksoud was appointed as the League of Arab States chief representative to the United States and the United Nations on September 1st, 1979. On August 15, 1990, he submitted his resignation from the League in the aftermath of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. A lawyer, journalist, and diplomat, Dr. Maksoud is the author of several articles and books on the Middle East and the Global South, among them The Meaning of Non-Alignment, The Crisis of the Arab Left, Reflections on Afro-Asianism, and the Arab Image. Clovis Maksoud was the chairperson and convener of many conferences on environment and development, human rights, population, and disarmament. Born on December 17, 1928, Dr. Maksoud graduated from the American University of Beirut, went on to receive his JD from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and did postgraduate studies at Oxford University in Britain. Whether the topic be a clash of civilizations, the Middle East peace process, or terrorism and fundamentalism, few people bring as much wisdom and understanding of the Arab world as does Clovis Maksoud. Dr. Maksoud has twice addressed this council to our great benefit, and we relish this, his third visit with us. It is an honor and an enormous pleasure to once again welcome Dr. Clovis Maksoud to the council.
Well, I'm very thankful not only for the introduction, but for the fact that I will be succeeded by somebody more controversial than I will be tonight. The topic tonight is so wide in scope that it would entitle me to sort of think and sometimes feel out loud. The world situation as we are experiencing these days necessarily allow us to weave in to what is happening in the Arab world with what is happening throughout the world. And perhaps our attentions at this moment is focused on what is taking place in Kosovo. And while we are deeply sympathetic and solidarized with the fate of the Albanian people because of the cultural, religious, intellectual affinities that the Arabs have with the Albanian people, yet it isn't the fact that it is a reflection and a manifestation of the solidarity, Islamic solidarity, but it is because what is taking place in Kosovo is sustained, discriminatory, oppressive eviction of the population there. In 1989, the Kosovans enjoyed a large measure of administrative and cultural autonomy. They deserve to have it restored. It is in this case that the merits of the case, rather than the purely religious dimension of it, that constitutes an Arab reaction and Arab support and sympathy for the people of Kosovo. Let me affirm that the Arabs can play a healing role into this tragic situation that is taking place because the Arabs are Muslims and Christians, and they evaluate events, developments, and causes more from an Arab collective perspective rather than a manifestation of a polarity in religious beliefs. This has been the tradition, the history, the legacy of the Arab nationalist project throughout the contemporary century. That does not mean that there aren't amongst us people who view issues from an optic of purely fanatic, insular, parochial, regional perspective. Yet, in the mainstream development, there has always been a consensus that transcends these differences in a way that has sustained Arab culture as a unity of diversity. I mention this because our concern is not only that the issue between the Serbs and the Kosovans and Albanians must not be viewed in a facile way as if it is a conflict between two religious groups. In some instances, it might be so manipulated, but in reality, it is not, because among the Serbian people and among the Orthodox people of Serbia, there are many who constitute a constituency of conscience, and they should not be looked upon as if they are totally identified with the reckless ruthlessness of the policies of Milosevic. I mention this also because while it is crucial that the international community is seized of this tragedy, it is important that while NATO is inflicting upon Yugoslavia a great deal of defanging its armed forces, the punishment that is meted out for Yugoslavia might be well-deserved, yet it is equally important that NATO does not replace in the final analysis the legitimizing instrument of global politics, namely the United Nations. It is in this anxiety about marginalizing the United Nations that the Arabs are equally deeply concerned. This is the immediate challenge that we are facing, because we consider that NATO is a military strategic framework. It does not have the ability or the mechanism to anticipate consequences of the actions that it undertakes, despite the fact that they are, in the military complex issues, able to deliver bombs in a very precise manner due to the high technical capabilities. Yet, it is important to realize that what is important is that any instrument, such as NATO, has to anticipate the consequences of its actions. And what the bombing that has done to defang the regime of Milosevic, correct as it might be, is leading to certain consequences. That is the massive outpouring of refugees that are taking place in Montenegro, in Macedonia, in Albania, and perhaps later on in other places. It is this opening of the Pandora box that has further victimized the Albanians who were earlier victimized by Milosevic. So I think that what is necessary at this moment is that this crisis must be looked upon as an integrated crisis which requires the revival and revitalization of the implements of analysis, intelligence analysis, preventive diplomacy, and perhaps more important, to bring back to central stage the United Nations as the source of international legitimacy. I know that this advocacy for the revival of the United Nations does not hit responsive chord in several sectors of the American people, particularly with the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who would not like even to entertain the option of having any kind of relationship with the United Nations. However, it is important that the UN remains the anchor and the source for international legitimacy. And I say that not only because the Arabs have vested a great deal in the legality of the United Nations. They have resorted to it to achieve their rights. In Algeria, during the independence movements in various other countries, and they have suffered some of the sanctions that have been imposed on the peoples in the region, among the Arabs, and they have equal causes to resent the United Nations because of the sanctions on Iraq, sanctions on Sudan, sanctions on Libya, and because the United States has, in the United Nations, shielded activities by Israel's expansion, settlements, annexation, and extinction of villages, 417 villages and towns in Israel today, which were part of the Arab Palestine. So there is a great deal of grievances, yet these grievances do not derail or deflect the commitment to the rule of international law in the same manner that the United States believes in the rule of law within the United States. Now, I'm mentioning this because this is the event of the day, of the week, and it was not anticipated when I was first invited and the snow blocked the roads. And on the other hand, this is today a contrast. The beauty of today's weather is only matched by the ugliness of what is taking place in Kosovo and in many other parts of the poorer countries of the world. Now, The Arab perspective on issues is conditioned by the global situation as a whole. They are living in the intersection between three continents: Asia, Africa, Mediterranean, Europe. They are affected. They have problems that have all sorts of ramifications. Their upstream rivers, like the Nile, where 84% of the water in the upstream is in Ethiopia, while 95% of the consumption of the Nile is in Egypt. They have the same problem in the Euphrates, where the upstream in Turkey and the building of the various dams renders the upstream in a way capable of manipulating the water for political and strategic purposes. It is in this respect that this challenge necessitates a greater integration among the Arab states. Unfortunately, that has not been adequately addressed. Furthermore, we are living in a period of history where two simultaneous trends are in a way in a state of conflict. On the one hand, the globalization of issues, environment, women's empowerment, social development, megacities in the developing countries. All these issues of environment, of population explosions, all these issues are global in nature. They are transnational. Refugees don't recognize borders, as we are even witnessing today. Refugees, illnesses, whether AIDS or any kind of illnesses that are characterizing and imposing a tremendous taxation on the lives of the peoples in Africa, on the young people of Africa. All these are problems that affect us, whether directly or indirectly. And because of this, we find that the global environment in which we are living is also matched by a conflicting trend of the fragmentation of civil societies and nation states along religious, ethnic, tribal lines that we are experiencing now in Yugoslavia, earlier in Somalia, in Rwanda, with a tremendous cost in human lives. In a way, genocide is partial but incremental. And that is why the whole world community is searching for a coherent sense of direction. And while we witness this global situation being polarized along north, south, rather than east-west, the Arabs have to decide for themselves. Are they an extension of the West, or are they an integral part of the South, or are they the catalyst between North and South? And in order to do so, they have to refine and determine their terms of references. It is here that the challenge is, are we living in an era where we are expected to address the market and the market forces, the interplay of free enterprise, which has a great deal of benefits, but on the other hand, it has stimulated vulnerabilities, as we have witnessed in the crash that took place in Southeast Asia. So while we are in the endeavor of seeking a sense of direction, it is important that we, as part of the South, begin to determine our priorities. And in spelling out these priorities, it does not mean, if they are distinguished from the priorities of the West, that they are necessarily in a state of confrontation with the West. It is in this context that we have to choose at times between addressing the global market or addressing the world community. The global market is impersonal. The global market is forces that objectively interact. The world community is the community of human beings and societies. And so, while the market should be at the service of the world community, we have experienced, as we have seen in Russia and in some of the emerging markets in the developing countries, we have seen how the world community has been subordinated to the imperatives of the market forces. It is this challenge that brings us forward to think that the challenges that are facing us have to be met on the conditions that we help the architecture of the new so-called world order rather than allowing the world order to be built for us. So it is this kind of reasoning that explains many of the developments that are taking place throughout the Arab world. And that is why I wanted to speak about Arab perspectives on these various global issues. Let me start by saying that Arab nationalism has been associated with the new generations of Arabs with failure in front of the Israeli challenge. And it has also been associated with regimes of oppression and suppression, dictatorships. And as a result of that, there has developed an alienation between Arab generations. This is an internal challenge, but it has consequences on the overall environment in which we live beyond being Arabs. It has an impact on what is taking place today, whether in Iraq, or in Sudan, or in Algeria, or in Iran. What is taking place is that the rise of Islamic fundamentalism is construed as a penalty for the lack of coherence, democracy in the Arab national patrimony. Islamic fundamentalism is also a reaction for the fear of the unknown. When the Arab national sentiment and commitment collapses and shows signs of dependency, of fragmentation, the unifying factor that characterized the whole history of Arab nationalism is replaced by the appeal of Islamic fundamentalism. Yet, on the other hand, that while the Arabs are in a majority of Muslims, yet the root of Christianity within the Arab nation is as much entitled to partake in shaping the destiny of the Arabs as the Muslims. It is in this kind of secular politics that Arab nationalism can retrieve its role as the instrument and vehicle of Arab Renaissance. This is now eluding us. It is eluding us because of many reasons. One is that we are a rich nation of poor people. Our wealth has not addressed properly and adequately and significantly our poverty. This is a challenge because, in many instances, it was superseded by not only the alienation among generations, but by the political fragmentation that has taken place among the Arab states. And here we find a dilemma to explain to the new generation how would a country like Egypt and Jordan have diplomatic relations with Israel at the same time when Lebanese resistance to occupation takes place in the south of Lebanon. Now, resistance is not only a militant resistance, it can take the forms of civil resistance. And we have seen how, for a long time, it was coming, that in Arnoun, which was annexed by Israel 2 months ago, it was the students of the American University of Beirut, of the Lebanese American University of Beirut, of the people in the Jesuit University, in the Lebanese University. They are the ones who entered, broke all the ties, and went and established themselves as the local national authority for the first time. A Lebanese occupied territory was liberated peacefully by the students of Lebanon. This, my friends, is a significant indication that despite the disarray that we witness throughout the Arab world, despite the fact that we have entered into agreements which are flawed, such as the Oslo Agreement. And I say that not because I do not want to see peace in the region, because I don't believe that this is a peace process. It is a peace that is being undone because the Oslo Agreement has not acknowledged that Israel in the occupied territories is an occupying power. It is this basic flaw that renders Israel in the West Bank and East Jerusalem a claimant power. And this was why the peace process has been interrupted, arrested, frozen, and unproductive. And therefore, it is necessary that we all realize that the United States, however much its domestic politics requires shielding Israel from sanctions and condemnations, it is equally important that the United States, as the sole superpower on the world scene, is not perceived as a biased power incapable of objective judgment on the merits of the issues. It is this sort of attitude and policy that has always created the levels of confusion. But there are bright spots. There are bright spots and dark spots. We see in Turkey and in Algeria the distortion of two important phenomena. The distortion of secularism by the military, who are suppressing human rights, denying minorities access to equity. In Algeria, we find that the butchery that is taking place and the suppression, butchery by some of the Islamic fundamentalism and oppressiveness and recklessness by some of the so-called military secularists. It is high time that we begin to extricate the whole distortions of secularism and of Islamism in order to refocus on the Arab national project. This Arab national project, however, requires a new discourse and a new set of priorities. The Arab national discourse must emphasize that it is associated in the minds of the people and the new generation with environmental quality, with women's empowerment on an equal basis, because we cannot enter the 21st century with a paralysis of one part of the society. We must, on the other hand, begin to develop a concept of civil society as a partner of the state rather than the state subsuming civil society, as it is in many of the authoritarian regimes in the world. We must commit ourselves to human rights and let the chips fall where they may. And let us also realize that we have to define human rights not exclusively in terms of political rights, freedom of speech, of association, of religious pursuit. These are very cherished freedoms, but they are political freedoms. Democracy, if it is to be established within the Arab context, it has to be defining human rights as also satisfying basic human needs. It is vital to realize that we are living in a situation where 20% of the global wealth is available to 84% of the human population. And the reverse is true, where nearly 80% of the global wealth is in the hands of 20% of the human population. This is the challenge not only for the Arabs, it is a challenge for the United States, for Russia, for Africa, and for Asia. If we do not address this fundamental problem, we will then find a repeat of what is taking place in Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, Angola, Cambodia, and now in Kosovo. We will be seeing people at the age of 16 who constitute nearly 50% of the populations in Africa, either standing in line at the various consulates of Europe and the United States, trying to immigrate because of the joblessness, or they can go to a church or a Hindu temple or a mosque to be manipulated by religious fanatics who provides them the promise of deliverance at a later stage in human life. We are therefore confronted at this moment with a multiplicity of challenges that requires a level of global governance. The global governance doesn't mean a global government. On the contrary, it is a process of transition to restore the infrastructure in many of the developing countries. It means, in our case, that the Arabs must undertake the measures to link our collective poverty with our collective wealth in a transformative equation. Unless we do that, we're going to remain vulnerable. We're going to remain living in a dizzy, questioning process. How can we resist the Israelis in one place and have diplomatic relations and call ourselves Arab? This is a question which might sound possible in the West, but it is mind-boggling to the Arabs and the rest. And so what we are witnessing today is no longer that the affairs are foreign. They are interconnected. We are present at the stage and on the threshold of the 21st century, where we are all one community, divided, fragmented, but not foreign to each other. Thank you very much.
Dr. Maksoud raised very interesting issues, and I'm sure that these issues will generate a lot of questions. We will repeat the question for the benefit of our TV audience. The question is, how do you define poverty?
Inaccessibility to resources, the marginalization within a society, the absence of ameliorative measures in terms of health, education, and the function of life being exclusively survival and not for many years to come.
Do you imply that those who have excess of wealth provide or cause poverty?
Well, if we admit that ultimately there's lots of resources, but there are limits on the resources, and the level of distribution does not address the issues of equity among nations and within nations. And to that extent, concentration of wealth, not invested wealth, concentration of wealth does cause a prevalence of poverty in a particular society. When you realize that 1% of international trade and commerce for the 20% of the poorest countries of the world, while 84%, maybe more too, of the international trade is concentrated in 20% of the upper wealthy classes in the world. You have the allocation of resources is at this moment quite misguided.
The question is, who should decide the reallocation of these resources?
Well, you see, that is a very interesting question, because we have, on the global level, two simultaneous instruments of allocating resources besides the national instruments. One is the UN system as such, namely the UNDP, the World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, the FAO, Food and Agriculture, etc. They focus on human development. And on the other hand, you have the Bretton Woods institutions, which are more recently becoming sensitive to the issues of poverty and the need to fight poverty. But they are governed more or less by the Western democratic states. And they have a sort of monopoly on decision-making processes concerning economic growth. While the marginality of the UN specialized agencies who are focusing on human development, they are, at this moment, there is an attempt to cross-fertilize economic growth with human development. That has not yet been achieved, and therefore, what is necessary is that there must be an element of political stability to enable the resources not only to be reallocated, but to have certain degree of productive investment. So who decides? The decision is still proliferated into many agencies and instruments of governance.
Can you comment on the upcoming Israeli election and its outcome on Lebanon?
Well, I would comment in general to say that there are, among the three major candidates, a very distinctive characteristic of style. I think that the rhetoric of the Labour Party is much more sophisticated, and it is in the tradition of Western narratives. I think Netanyahu, who was in a way my next door in the Security Council, is somebody who is very assertive, belongs to the Jabotinsky tradition of Zionist revisionism, and in a way he says it as he thinks it should be said, and it is very provocative, it's alienating, but it can consolidate a core element of fanatics around him, especially that he, beyond the veneer of his sophisticated English, lies a very cruel mind. And so, in a way, there is that distinction. And I know that I'm saying this, but we have been described by Mr. Netanyahu even much worse than that. So don't blame me. And there is Mordecai. Mordecai seems to be a sort of a reasonable element. And unless now what is happening in the Israeli elections is a very interesting new dimension, and that is Azmi Bshara, who's a member of the Knesset, running as an Arab for prime minister, knowing full well that this is a Jewish state and no Arab would be elected, but at least he's trying to empower the Arabs to say that they share in decision and policy making, and it is no longer an exclusively Jewish state. He wants to replace the Jewishness of the state with Israeli citizenship, where Arabs and Jews are equal. Now, whether this phenomena will succeed, at this moment, I don't think so, but it is a breakthrough which can be pursued in the future. Now, where do the Arab votes would lie? I think they fluctuate between Mordecai and the Labour, but that is no guarantee that the split among the three is making the elections rather difficult to anticipate the results. On the other hand, as far as Lebanon is concerned, I think that the Israelis have realized that their occupation of South Lebanon and their usage of the militia as a vicarious military presence for Israelis' objectives has been very costly, and that the resistance is now becoming much broader, much more inclusive, and no longer exclusively Hezbollah. I think that is an important development, and the unfortunate part is what is taking place in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, Israel, in its pattern of expansion, has already decided to preempt any outcome for the negotiations of the last resort. And while East Jerusalem is legally and legitimately an occupied territory, Israel treats it as if it is the perennial and eternal capital of Israel. In that sense, that would always remain a flashpoint for conflict in the future if it is not addressed in a just and equitable manner to the interest of having it either corpus separatum, as the Vatican has advocated, or as the capital of two states. And there is a precedent for that in Chandigarh. Chandigarh in India is the capital of two federal states of Haryana and Punjab, and they function very harmoniously after they have separated. And I think you might want to entertain the idea that the example and the paradigm of Chandigarh can be applied to Jerusalem in order to diffuse the extreme tensions that the occupation and the annexation of Jerusalem constitutes for the Arab, the Muslim, and the Christian worlds in general.
In Kosovo, how do you see the United Nations and NATO getting together to resolve the question?
Well, the unfortunate part of it is that the United Nations is being, at this moment, marginalized. There is a great deal of despondency within the United Nations. The United States has not paid its dues. If it doesn't pay $200 million in the next few weeks, it would lose its vote in the General Assembly. It does not lose, under any circumstances, its vote in the Security Council. It is something that is sad, because when you say the United Nations, you get a smile of pity among many people who says this is inconsequential. Well, the United Nations was utilized during the Iraqi war, was totally paralyzed during the Palestinian-Israeli negotiation. It was totally removed from the scene by the NATO in the Kosovo. It was not activated in Rwanda with a result of nearly 500,000 people. So there is not a sufficient commitment to the validating capacity that the United Nations bestows on the international community through its legitimizing functions. And we must not forget that the United Nations, the International High Commission for Human Rights, for refugees, are always resorted to because of their inherent credibility. And the training of international civil servants would have anticipated that if the bombing continues to take place, refugees are going to move out. This NATO is not equipped to anticipate because it is a defense, military, strategic organization. It is not equipped with the social departments, economic departments. It has not been equipped, and it is dealing with a complex situation which it cannot be familiar, to the extent that, that spokesmen for the Pentagon and for the military in Europe are in a way interpreting foreign policy. And that can be very harmful to the future of peace and international security that the Security Council of the United Nations has been mandated to undertake.
What would you feel would have happened if NATO did not do any action and left it to the United Nations?
Well, as I said in my original remarks, that Milosevic deserved the penalty. But what I'm trying to reflect upon is that the NATO operation not only could not anticipate the follow-up that is taking place now and the confusion, but it is not endowed with the political, economic, social, psychological, cultural ramifications. It is not endowed with the capability. It's endowed tremendously with the capability of striking, of defending, of operating military functions, but it is not endowed or equipped with the capacity to deal with the complexity of the consequences that have ensued as a result of its military operations. Now, it is true that if the ethnic cleansing that was taking place before NATO, we must say that, and the record of last years of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and other places required an immediate collective intervention. The United Nations would have been too slow, and I agree to that, there was the risk of the Russians might veto any kind of operation. But they didn't veto in Iraq. There is certain cases which can bring about, at worst, an abstention, which would allow the legitimate rubric of the United Nations to be covering whatever enforcement measures that takes place. In this case, NATO, in a way, after the end of the Cold War, was unemployable. And therefore, they had to redefine their existence and the role of their existence. And in that definition has not yet been completed, and as a result, they go into ad hoc arrangements. Now they're saying that because Kosovo is in Europe, they are entitled under the NATO Charter to intervene. All right, if something happens in Rwanda or in Congo, who's going to intervene? Who's going to try and prevent the escalation of conflicts in the region of Africa or between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, or here and there, etc. Which is NATO? Then NATO is becoming the substitute for the United Nations? Or are we supposed to get the Arab League, the Organization of African Unity, etc., to undertake the military, and therefore we militarize political and social development? And that is not the way that we should endeavor to enter into the 20th century New World Order.
The question is, with all the money that was given to Mr. Arafat and in the Middle East, where did it go?
Well, in every new developing unit, there is a margin, we'll call it the margin of error and the margin of corruption. And sometimes it's tolerated and sometimes it shouldn't be tolerated. But the amount of money that the United States has invested in not only the Palestinian community but throughout the Arab world, including Egypt, is way below what the United States has provided, given, assisted, and aided Israel. And I think this discrepancy is another complicating factor in the process of achieving the just peace that has so long eluded us. And while there is not enough transparency and accountability in the Palestinian situation, there is now a gauging of the earmarking much of the assistance, especially by European countries, and to a lesser extent by the World Bank, and the United States is only very, very little. That level of transparency has been insisted upon, and I think it's beginning to show that accountability is much better than corruption. Now, we find this situation now taking place in the European Union, where the whole cabinet of the European Union had to resign collectively because they received all sorts of bribes.
Is anything the United Nations can do to lift the sanctions?
Well, I think what is happening now, especially on the Iraqi situation, and I think that is an important thing, because what is taking place in Iraq is the total destruction of the social fabric of the Iraqi people. And I think this is one of the most tragic events and consequences that is taking place as a result of sanctions. There is, and this is what I also partook in suggesting or recommending, that there should be a decoupling in the sanction regime. There should be selective sanctions. You sanction the government for non-compliance in allowing UNSCOM or whatever inspection team does have to take place. You have all sorts of a scope of sanctions that can be applied, not cutting or reducing diplomatic relations, disallowing exchange of money, etc. There are many sanctions. But the economic sanctions on the people of Iraq is so unfair, so cruel at times, that it is impossible to allow these two sanctions to function as one. You think that the government of Iraq is defying international law? Okay, you apply selective sanctions. You do not apply comprehensive sanctions of the people of Iraq, who have now almost lost their middle class, and who have been so defanged that the conscience of the Arabs, even those who suffered from the regime of Iraq, in the Gulf countries, who are saying you must distinguish between our opposition to the regime of Iraq and our total solidarity and sympathy with the people of Iraq. However, the United States at this moment doesn't have the time to think about 2-3 crises at the same time. So the United States is paralyzed in bringing about. You have the Kosovo, which is now the focus of concentration in the United States, and we have a situation where the United States, on the one hand, says that we are the leaders of the world, And on the other hand says we're not the global policemen of the world. And you have, we don't know when it wants to be a policeman like it was in Iraq in 1990, when it is now part of a policeman in Kosovo, but we're not the global policeman in Rwanda or Burundi or Congo, where there is no vital economic interest. And when the United States says that I am the global superpower, fine, everybody is deferential to that status. But on the other hand, I will intervene only where our national interest requires us to do so. Well, people in the world want to know what constitutes the national interest of the United States so they know how to deal with it. Unfortunately, the language of your global policy does not warrant the confidence of sustainable development or sustainable peace. In Kosovo, you intervened. In Rwanda, you did not. Because in Rwanda, you said, we're not going to be the policemen of the world. And that has a constituency in the United States. And on the other hand, we are intervening for humanitarian purposes. And then you get the Somalia syndrome, which has replaced up to a point the Vietnam syndrome. Witnessing, the CNN brought American troops under the UN rubric into Somalia, and the CNN brought them out. And this is not a small country of Bhutan or Burma. This is the United States, the only superpower in the world, fluctuating between asserting that it is the leader and on the other hand it is not the global policeman. This confusion reflects itself also in many ways throughout the Arab dealing with the United States. Let me just make one last observation before. You know, what happened in Iran? The election of Khatami in Iran, by a 70% majority, and also recently in the elections, was due to the women empowering themselves and forcing the mullahs to accept democratization. And I think that should be emulated.
Thank you, Dr. Maksoud. Dr. Maksoud raised so many issues that we can spend the rest of the evening here asking questions, benefiting from his knowledge and experience. Unfortunately, we are having a time limit, and I apologize for that. On behalf of the Board of Trustees and on behalf of everybody here tonight, I would like to thank you again, Dr. Maksoud.